All right, thanks for joining us today. This is our panel on foreign policy in the midterms. I'm Colin Dewick, a Gene Kirkpatrick visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The conventional wisdom, of course, is that foreign policy is not an issue at all in the election, but there's actually evidence that a number of international policy issues broadly defined are of some concern to American voters right now and will factor into their decisions. We'll discuss all of this. If you think about midterm elections in general, there's different types in terms of their relationship to foreign policy. One is what you might call the quagmire, right? There have been examples of that historically. 1966, 2006, where the incumbent party's hurt. This doesn't seem to be one such year. However voters feel about Afghanistan, it doesn't seem to be a top issue for voters right now. A second type is the ringing endorsement, right, of the incumbent president. This is surprisingly rare. 2002 is one example where George W. Bush, with his high approval ratings on counterterrorism at that time, helped his party pick up seats in both houses. But this is very unusual. Another type of midterm is one where foreign policy is not an issue at all. But then finally, you have elections where it's secondary but significant. And I think I'd argue that that's where we're at today. This is most midterms since the 1940s. And the reasons for this simply are that given America's role in the world since World War II, there's really no getting away from it. Is a president managing that role competently or not? This ties into broader perceptions of presidential leadership, even during times of midterm elections. And the second reason is President Trump in particular has bundled together what you might call transnational issue areas such as trade and immigration with foreign policy traditionally defined into a more nationalist platform. This includes counterterrorism and national security as well. His political opponents have no choice but to address that bundle, whether they agree with it or not. So while most top issues this fall are domestic, there is some evidence that foreign policy, terrorism, trade, and so on are politically significant. We'll discuss all of this. And then finally, we'll discuss the reverse question, namely, how might the midterm election results affect the administration's foreign policy? So I'm happy to say we have a distinguished panel. Starting to my right, Myra Miller is Senior Vice President of the Winston Group, a strategic planning and survey research firm. She has advised House and Senate leadership, Fortune 100 companies, and center-right parties in Europe on a range of policy issues. She also served as political director for the Republican Party in Alabama for several years. Next to her, Tom Davis represented Virginia's 11th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1995 to 2008. He's currently Director of Federal Government Affairs at Deloitte, Rector of George Mason University, where I know for a fact his class in Southern politics gets rave reviews. To his right, Carlin Bowman is an expert on polling, our top analyst of American polls and public opinion here at AEI, and a senior fellow. She also writes a weekly column for Forbes. And then finally, Rick Dearborn of the Cyprus Group was White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Legislative, Intergovernmental Affairs, and Implementation in the Trump administration. Prior to that, he was Executive Director of the Trump Presidential Transition Team. He worked for 6 U.S. senators, including Senator Jeff Sessions, as Chief of Staff, and spent more than 25 years on Capitol Hill. He was also Assistant Secretary of Energy for Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs from 2003 to 2004. Please welcome our panelists. So I'm going to begin with our panel by giving them all a chance, maybe beginning with Myra, to answer the first general question, which is, what is the overall role of foreign policy issues in these midterm elections? To what extent is it an issue? And does it tend to help one party as opposed to the other?
Well, when you talk about foreign policy issues, I could cover a broad range of things. It's an issue set that has historically favored Republicans in terms of confidence in handling the issues. It's also an issue set that Republican and conservative voters typically place more emphasis on. But in this cycle, I think we're seeing a difference between what's an important issue and what's a decision-making issue. There are aspects of foreign policy that are, I think, playing more of a role than others. But I would put that in the category of an important, not necessarily a decision-making issue as we understand it right now, but certainly that could be the case.
Tom?
Well, Look, I think part of Trump's appeal to a more populist base was that the world order, if you will, globalization wasn't working for everybody. And he advocated kind of disrupting that and coming back to a more nationalist perspective. So when he pulls out of the Paris Climate Accords, when he pulls out of the Iran nuclear deal, I think it solidifies himself with the base as a disruptor because the public at large hasn't seen any of the failures that I think that his political opponents said would come about. He starts talking tough on North Korea, and then he goes over and meets with the president of North Korea. So I think in a way it has helped him, at least with his base, and solidified against his opposition, which seems to think this is an incompetent bumblebum that's going to get us into war. So I think to that extent it has solidified himself with his base, coupled that with a good economy, I think is going to mitigate the effects of what could have otherwise been a very, very difficult midterm.
Carlin?
I agree with Myra's assessment of foreign policy generally and the role it's playing in this election. If you look at the national polls, you see that foreign policy is one of the lowest ranked issues. In the most recent poll that came out yesterday from NBC News and the Wall Street Journal, only 3% said foreign policy or terrorism would be one of the two most important issues to them in casting their vote. And I think 7 times as many mentioned the economy and 6 times as many mentioned healthcare. So that gives you a sense of where it is. But I also agree that it is always there. And I tend to think about it as the burners on a stove. You have a lot of issues on the front burners at a full boil, exactly what voters are concentrating on, but you also have issues on the back burners that are at a steady simmer and they can rise to a full boil at any time. And I think that's certainly true of foreign policy and terrorism. But I agree with the broader context that Myra has set.
Well, I think that the president, even prior to the election, was dubious with, I don't want to say interventionist policy, foreign policy, but he was concerned about what we were doing abroad. Obviously, the country was quite war fatigued. We'd been at war in the Middle East for a very long time. I think he was focused on trying to create more of a kind of a realpolitik, a Nixonian foreign policy. Instead of creating mini Americas across the globe or telling folks that they should accept our Constitution and recreate their country or be the world's policeman, I think he tried to look and see what was the American or the national interest in taking an action across the globe. And I think that's the reason why he's, in many instances, he's kind of thought through it before he's acted. But I do think that foreign policy is, as you've said, Colin, it's kind of a secondary track. But he's raised these issues, and they've become very political. I mean, I think immigration is a foreign policy issue, I guess, in the terms of what we're seeing now with regards to the large caravan that's coming up through Central America and Mexico. I think North Korea is, at least in the back of folks' mind, a very dangerous place. But he's been pretty successful, at least in a first meeting and a promise of more. And I also think that trade is probably the best arena to look at when you think about at least foreign involvement, his ability to go back and renegotiate NAFTA in a new form, to be talking about trade with not only our allies but also with our peer competitors. I think that those things kind of create at least a sense among the electorate that he's putting the country first, fighting for the American worker, for the American people, and I think that can play out in the elections.
Rick, let me just follow up on that. It's sometimes said we live in a populist era. What do you think that means for public opinion on foreign policy issues? Does that affect election results? Populism?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it can. I mean, I would defer to our polling experts to give you a little bit more flavor of that. I think the president has a way of tapping into not only what's popular with people, but to define it in terms of the American interest, the national interest. So when you are putting on tariffs, when you're trying to reset the table on trade, for example, and it's going to have an impact on America's farmers, and there's going to be pain before there's any type of gain that they see. The fact that when they're interviewed currently, especially about all the media outlets, I know they keep trying to go out and find people that are upset by these policies, and they'll always find some. But a lot of folks that they interview will say, look, I'm not happy about it. I'm making a little bit less money. But you know what? I'm willing to stick it out. I'm willing to ride it out because I think he's going to cut us a better deal with that country. So I think there's a buy-in of what the president's doing. I think trade, in my opinion, is probably the one item that probably resonates the most right now that is in the foreign policy arena. I think there's other tick-ups that have happened. I think you see North Korea tick up and you feel a little bit more secure about that. Obviously, we can talk about Iran. We can talk about the immigration, the caravans coming up too. But I think that right now, most folks feel like, especially on trade, he's going to go out and cut a better deal, and that's going to mean something better for them in their lives. And when the economy is growing at 4% plus, you're feeling pretty good anyway.
Myra, would you comment on this, the theme of populism and trade policy and how this is playing in the election?
I have a slightly different interpretation of the term populism. I think of that in terms of situations in which people have the perception that the political class and elites are not effectively addressing the concerns that they have. And it's a sentiment that is not only seen here, but we're seeing it globally, especially in Europe. So in this last election, we certainly saw that. And if in 2015, Colin, if you had had me on this panel, I had said next year Republicans are going to have a candidate at the top of the ticket with 60% unfavorables, and not only is he going to win, but Republicans are going to hold Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. You probably would have said, "I'll never have you back to AEI again." So that situation, this populist feeling, did create an unconventional result. And in terms of will we see something like this manifest in the midterm elections, it's a little hard to say, but I will tell you that 1 out of 4 voters says that they have an unfavorable view of both Republicans and Democrats. They don't like either one. Among independent voters, that percentage is even higher. It's about 41%. So what that leads to is a significant level of volatility and probably some late decision-making. So could you see many of those same elements manifest in 2018 that you saw in 2016? Absolutely.
Tom, do you think trade is an issue in these midterms, and specifically where and how?
Well, I think trade was certainly an issue in 2016, and it's the reason that Trump was so successful in the Midwest, and he's followed through on that, trying to hold that coalition. Look, I think getting an agreement with Mexico and Canada basically validates his narrative that we had bad trade agreements, we're getting trade agreements, and allowed farmers in Kansas to just kind of trust him and say it's going to get better. So in that sense, I think it is helping him solidify the kind of the new coalition that he's put in. But let's understand on a larger context that this is going on around the globe. The rapidity of change in the world today, culturally, economically, migration pattern, everything. This isn't unique to the United States. We've seen it in Brexit. Macron was a fourth party in France. The Five-Star Movement in Italy. Brazil's has disruptors all over. This is, with the rapidity of change, people are feeling rootless and groundless, and politics is becoming more nationalistic and tribal. Mm-hmm. And I think that Trump has tapped into that. And I think as he acts, a lot of us in Washington who've been here say, what's he doing? He understands very well what these movements are and is solidifying his base there. And we're seeing that in the last few weeks as his numbers have climbed and the economy's good. It may or may not be the best long term. But short term, I think it's going to mean that the Republican losses are not what they could have been.
Carlin, there's evidence that Wall Street Journal, I think, had a story yesterday saying that Republicans now have a 17-point edge on trade.
It's not what the other recent polls show. It may be an outlier, but that said, Republicans do have an advantage on handling trade. And I think the president's comments yesterday, trying to describe to an audience the difference between a nationalist and a globalist, were really very important in sort of talking about the fundamental principles of his foreign policy. We're reluctant internationalists. We know we're a global power. We have to do a lot of things in the world, but we're always reluctant. And I think we've been worried in the past that we haven't been putting America first.
So, Carlin, would you say that from the numbers, is there a suggestion that trade is more or less important, that it favors one party or the other?
I think right now it probably favors the Republicans, in part because, as Rick said, they're willing to give Trump more time on some of these issues overall. And I think he's setting the dialogue in a new direction, and I think it's a positive one for him and Republicans.
One of the issues that came up from several of you was immigration. I think there is agreement that that's an issue, but that, in a way that ties into foreign policy, countries like Mexico and Central American partners. How is this playing out on the borderline between electoral politics in the midterm and foreign policy, Rick?
Well, I think with immigration, and the Department of Justice has been focused on this a lot, so has Homeland Security, has been one element of what's coming into the country with MS-13 and gangs. And it's no longer just in big cities. I mean, this is in every neighborhood and every small town across the country, and people feel it. And they're savage, and it's shocking to a lot of folks. And if you live in rural town America, and all of a sudden you're seeing a larger gang presence, and the president's talking about the need to make sure that, first of all, immigration is in the national interest, that we want to welcome and open our borders to all those that want to come here and contribute, but we ought not be opening our borders to people that want to come in and commit crime or who do not care about our country. And I think that does create a political force in this country. I think it does resonate with voters. At the end of the day, everybody wants to feel safe. You want to be, you want to live in a neighborhood where you can raise your kids, where you can go to work, where you can go to the store and not have to worry about the threat of violence. And if you look at the uptick, and we see a lot of that directly related to immigration patterns. Now, I'm not saying that it is a driver, but it's part of it. And I think as far as an issue set, it's something that the president's been able to point to that does resonate with the voters.
Myra, is this what you call a decision issue as opposed to just an important one?
I think it could be. And I'm speaking more broadly on the issue of immigration. It tends to be something that the bases of both parties focus on, but in different ways. So for Republicans, they focus much more on the border security side of things. For Democrats, they focus much more on comprehensive reform, DACA, things like that. So they're coming at it from two different angles. But I think a more specific event, I think somebody on the other panel, the panel was talking about aspects that could be more significant than others. What's happening with this caravan, I think, is something that really could be potentially a decision-making issue in the next 2 weeks. And I know conservative media has been talking about it, the president's been talking about it. So with these undecided voters that are still in the process of making up their minds, what's happening with that could play a role in influencing how they make the decision the next 2 weeks.
Let me just add to that. I mean, if you took the Republican base, you see some xenophobia, and on the Democratic base, it's xenophilia. And there's a lot of area in between that where you have a lot of swing voters that this is the issue that's being presented to them with this caravan coming up in the last couple of weeks.
That's right.
And that becomes an issue that starts moving them because of the accent it's getting the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Initially, I thought President Trump ought to be talking about the economy and taking credit for that. But he's got great political instincts. He is a great marketeer, if nothing else. And he recognizes how the polarizing effect this is going to have, particularly in some of these Senate races, in terms of focusing on Democrats trying to defend 4,000, 10,000, or people not coming into the United States and not caring what the rules are. And I think that probably the middle is not comfortable with that. And so I think it rebounds to the Republicans' advantage in the closing days.
Can I just add on that too, that if you've looked at the way people have tried to respond to that too, specifically this caravan, the concerns over security, much easier for the Republicans to talk about it in terms of border security. Very difficult for the other side to kind of defend or at least come up with some way of dealing with it other than it being a border security issue. I mean, it's a humanitarian, of course, but you have 7,000 people getting ready to flood right at our southern border, and that is going to create a border security scenario. So I think it does become much more of a kind of a political item that can be weaponized by a lot of candidates, and it'd be a very tough thing to defend.
Can I just pick up on
Sure.
Let me just talk about my voters out in the suburbs that thought for a long time Trump was just too anti-immigrant. He was very distasteful. This kind of moves the needle a little bit now to saying, well, yeah, but the other side is thinking about letting just 10,000 people walk across the border. We can't do that.
That's
and
the
it has changed. It's basically changed the dynamic and changed the dialogue of this issue.
Yeah.
I agree with that generally, and what the panelists have said. I think immigration and DACA benefit the Democrats, but border security and illegal immigration definitely benefit the Republicans, and that's what the subject is right now.
And I would add to that, too, in 2016, you had about a quarter of the electorate, a voting electorate, who said that they made up their minds in the last month of the campaign. And if you look at time of decision-making and vote, those who broke much later went very heavily for Trump. So something like this in the late stage of the campaign could cause many of these races to swing one way or the other.
The one issue that's been a top issue at times is terrorism. It seems to have faded the last couple of years. 2014, 15 was a major issue. Is that precisely because of success against ISIS, or what's going on the issue of terrorism? Rick?
Yeah, I think ISIS. I mean, we've taken back almost all of Iraq, and we've changed the rules of engagement with ISIS. I think we've done a good job in combating them and providing our commanders on the ground the ability to do so. I do think that there is a terrorism element, and I'm not trying to go back on this issue, but when you talk about this caravan coming up, you're already seeing some of this being sprinkled into the rhetoric that's being used by candidates about the concern of with 7,000 to 10,000 people, it makes it a lot easier for all kinds of nefarious folks to get into the country. And how do you prevent that? And what's going to happen when they do reach the border? And I do think, I agree with Myra, I mean, that could be a decisional event that truly does turn the election. So if there is a issue of terrorism, it may be more manifest in what we see coming up with this caravan. But in general, I think it's something that has been a little bit more in the background as items like the economy growing and trade have kind of taken more center stage.
Harlan was using the term, it's like a burner on the stove. It's an issue it's not necessarily at the forefront right now, but it could escalate very quickly.
Right.
So looking at some specific countries, there's a lot of attention in the press about U.S. policy toward Russia and the Russia investigation. Is this something voters are terribly concerned about? Is this a vote-moving issue? Myra?
On the issue of Russia, I think there are different aspects of that. There's the how do we deal with Putin, how do we deal with them as a country? Then there's the Russia collusion, Mueller side of things. On the Mueller investigation side of things, obviously that's of much more importance and priority to liberals and Democratic voters, and there's been some frustration on their part that they haven't been able to make that more of a broad-based concern. So I would separate those two out.
I see.
I think politics is about who shows up. It's motivating your base, and then it's been galvanizing swing voters to move your direction. And I don't see Russia doing either of those. I don't see the talk in the press, and with apologies to the press here, with this murder over in Turkey of this Saudi Arabian citizen moving a lot of people. Media is talking a lot about it, but I don't see it moving voters. I'm not saying it's not important, but the question here is what does it do to American politics? And I think to that extent, foreign policy is kind of on the back burner.
The Mueller investigation in every recent poll is at the bottom of the list of things that people say is going to be important to them in casting their votes. But the difference between Republicans and Democrats on that issue, in one of the most recent polls, 19% of Republicans said it would be important to them, 79% of Democrats. So you get a sense of the deep partisan polarization on this issue overall. But I agree with what Myra had said about the issue overall.
So a year ago, there was some popular concern about tensions with North Korea, and North Korea has already come up. Is the sense now that it's just a sense of relief that negotiations are on? Is this something voters worry about? Are they relieved? Is it an issue? Rick?
Yeah, I think it provides a little sense of security. I mean, this is a guy that was firing off and testing missiles at a pretty rapid clip. Now he's not doing that. I think that provides a sense of security for the American public. I think it provides a sense of security in the Korean Peninsula. I think it is at least to date, something that the president has had a chance to be successful on. There's still more to go and a lot to do. But I do think it's something that it relieves the American public. But I still think the public and definitely the administration are still very wary of what might happen next. It's a very unpredictable regime. There's a very far way to go. But yeah, I think it's a wait and see, but I think people are probably not as anxious as they've been.
I think it did manage to ratchet down the temperature on that situation to some degree, but the public is still waiting to see to what extent is there going to be substantive change in that relationship. Well,
the one thing it's done is that to the media and I say the traditionalists who think Trump was way out of the box and putting the country, there's a kind of a validation to Trump supporters that nothing's happened. We're talking to these people now. They've quit firing missiles. Maybe this guy's not as crazy as you've been telling us. And I think you can take it across the board into different areas of foreign policy where they say, well, he did this and we're jeopardized. And at least to date, I don't think his voters and some swing voters are seeing what the press might have predicted.
Can I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
I was just going to pick up on what Tom said because it just ties. But you said it twice on validating. Once was on trade, now in North Korea. And in some ways, it's like checking boxes. You know, he was on the campaign trail and said, yeah, I'd talk to him. Or, hey, we're going to redo these deals. And everybody's wary of that. Of course, I think that to Myra's point about populism, it was, you know, kind of an us versus them. The folks in D.C. really aren't getting the job done. We're going to try to give this guy a chance. But I think he has, because of these actions, been able to validate what he talked about in the campaign. And I think those things will enable him to do more and hopefully validate more of the campaign promises he's made as he kind of goes through the checklist of trying to complete those things. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I don't think Americans have any illusions about North Korea. They haven't fallen in love. But that said, if you look back historically at polls about foreign policy over a very long period of time, we've always wanted to sit down and talk to our enemies. All throughout the Cold War, polls showed that we wanted to sit down and talk with the Russians. I think people are very happy we're sitting down and talking with the North Koreans now.
Yeah.
Add to that in terms of what Rick and Tom are saying, that you really cannot separate out sort of the construct by which Trump was elected and how he looks at whether it's foreign policy or the economy or trade or whatever it is, that in the last election, rightly or wrongly, it was seen as a choice between change versus the status quo. And so this essentially became a rock-the-boat election. In the exit polls, the most important presidential attribute was can deliver needed change, and Trump won that overwhelmingly 82-14. So I think he views his approach to these issues that we were just describing from that construct. It's a statement about why he believes he's president.
One of the interesting things he did in 2016 was to make Chinese economic behavior a top issue. Prior to that, in D.C., in both parties, it was mainly the military angle that was discussed. So are voters sold on this? I mean, do people vote on it? Is it a popular concern? How does the American public think about China right now?
Well, I remember when Al Gore, I think it was, who talked about China being a strategic partner, and at the time somebody else said China was a strategic competitor. China is definitely a strategic competitor, and that's the way Americans have seen China on economic issues for a long time. They know China cheats. That's a big issue, I think, for them, and Trump's been talking about that a lot. So once again, this is an area where I think they're willing to give Trump more time.
I think it's more time. Obviously, you can look at the markets. There's a lot of anxiety about picking a trade war with China at this point and how this plays out over the long term and the short term. And we don't know how this turns out. But I think we're talking through the election. I think people are willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think these trade deals with Canada and Mexico were validations that we're on the right track and we're going to give them more time. But you can see in the marketplace the anxiety over this thing in terms of people not sure that you'll win this battle at the end of the day.
And Americans don't think a trade war can be won.
And there are no winners. It's
they're winners.
But I think on the flip side of that, there's also a sense that the current system isn't working well.
Correct.
And so
Exactly.
what do we do there in terms of how well the current system's working? Only 8% of the electorate said that it's working very well. So on something like tariffs, I think the attitude, as you all were describing, is, well, let's just give it a try and see how that works to change the system, which isn't working well. If there was something else on the table to be considered, they would consider that as well. So I think that's giving him more time.
Well, don't you think once he gets past the midterms, I mean, if there's any damage China can do, it'd be before the midterms where they could start damaging. I mean, if you take a look at where their tariffs were, it was head right into Trump country, the agricultural belt and some of these areas. Once you get through that, the president's got another year or so before the presidential election kicks in, where the pressure is going to be on China. If their GDP isn't increasing and the like, they have some internal problems, and it'll be a waiting game and see who blinks first. And at the end of the day, you're hopeful that both sides recognize this is a no-win situation. They come to a deal, and everybody declares victory and goes home.
And I think that's a great point. I think at this stage the pressure is really on China. I mean, they're extremely bright. They've planned their economies for years. They have books that tell them exactly how to respond when our government does X, Y, and Z on trade. And along comes Donald Trump. And now they have to take their book and completely rip it up because he's not doing anything that they've been used to. He's actually exercising the powers that he has as the executive on tariffs. When he's laid down 200 and 250 billion and their only ability is to come back with 60 billion, it kind of goes to the point about opening up markets and the need to do that in China. And I think it has put them on their heels some. And I think that the American public are willing to give him the time that he'll need to try to come to some type of resolution of that. And they've just announced, I think recently, he and Xi are going to be meeting at the G20 So I also think that all of these trade deals, including the new revamped Mexico-Canada, announcing a deal that you want to get a deal with Japan, announcing that you want to start talking to the European Union, knowing that you have China out here to be resolved, but putting that greater pressure on China because you're announcing these deals is kind of lining up possibly before working out something with them. So as much as that is pressure on us, I think it puts a great deal of pressure on them.
So you both anticipated my next question, which is reversing the direction and saying, so what impact might the midterm have on U.S. foreign policy, if any? You can imagine this going different directions depending on who has control of the House, who's in charge of different committees, but also the extent to which the president decides to make changes or not based on the midterm results. So let's tackle that question. What might you expect some of the implications of the midterm conclusion to be for the administration's foreign policy in different areas moving ahead?
First thing that comes to my mind is there's going to be a significant refocus on Russia. Because if Democrats take the House, they are obviously going to bring that to the forefront. I think more broadly, it does give the president less latitude, but in terms of an area of emphasis, I think it definitely raises that again.
Do you, Myra, just to follow up, are you just talking about the investigations, or are you talking about actual U.S. policy on the ground in Europe? And the Middle East?
I think it could affect all of it.
Okay. Tom?
You know, Congress doesn't do much anyway. You have a Republican Congress now, and not much is going out if you don't have reconciliation, because you still need non-democratic votes in the Senate, and those are very hard to get on issues of significance. The Senate is important because all of your appointees, your ambassadors, your judges, your regulatory bodies, all of these people go through the Senate. So the new governance model is you run through executive agency, you govern by executive agency, regulation, and you have the courts uphold it. And President Obama did that his last 6 years, and that's what the presidents had to do most of the time. And that's why they're giving priorities to the regulatory agencies and the judges in terms of eating up the 30 hours per nominee of Senate time to move those people into place. So the House may well flip. And if the House flips, what that means is Democrats will have gavels to go after, as you say, Russia. They'll have to go after climate accords. They'll have to go on Iran deal if they want to do it, although the chairman in the House opposed the Iran nuclear deal. But I think you're going to see on the investigative side trying to show that there's something wrong with Trump. Remember the narrative of MSNBC and CNN and the Democrats that this guy's an incompetent idiot. He's going to get us into war. And the more successes you have to some swing voters, and certainly to the base, are saying, what are you talking about? Look at the results we're getting. Only time will tell whose narrative is right on this. But I think over the short term, even a Democratic Congress going after those issues, it may not be the pay dirt they think is there.
I think a lot depends on what happens in the Mueller investigation, if we hear from that shortly after the election. But right. I basically agree, investigate, and those will mostly be domestic on Trump's personality, or Trump's person, Trump's businesses, and the way Trump's governed.
Yeah, I think if the gavels change, it's going to be a lot of oversight, a ton of it, and that's probably the impact on foreign policy. So what is it in the House? Like foreign relations on the House?
Foreign affairs.
Foreign affairs. So the foreign affairs.
Elliot Engel will be chairman.
Right. So, if they don't like what he's doing in a certain part of the globe, I could see them bringing up, secretaries and undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, and they'll have time to do it. And the more time they spend bringing up administration officials to have to testify in front of Congress, the less time the administration officials have to execute what they've been asked to do by the president. So I think that creates some problem. But I do think if the Senate holds, then issues of treaties, I think those all remain. Trade's probably the one item because either house can be disruptive when it comes to trade. But I think that's also an area where there could be agreement with the Democrats. So,
what are the drivers in terms of the possibility of the new NAFTA passing, depending on the results? I mean, what are the...
I think it's going to pass. Members I talked to that I think it passes, and it probably passes bigger than NAFTA. Because you're going to have Democratic support, I think, for some of these. This is not a bad agreement from a Democratic perspective when you take a look at some of the elements.
I think it's really good. I think it should pass. I think if it's going to be held up, it'll be held up and make a point so that they can make a point on labor and environmental issues to try to galvanize and at least kind of fire up their base as they head into the presidential election.
But on labor environment's better than under NAFTA.
It is, but remember, there's better and there's what they
perfect.
expect to be the perfect. And there's agendas out there and a lot of fundraising tied to it, so I wouldn't be surprised by that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see progressives saying in some cases, actually, this is sort of what we had asked for over the years. So is there a sense that President Trump has redefined in some ways what it means to be Republican or conservative on foreign policy? Is there more continuity or is there more change? Rick?
I don't think there's more continuity. I think it is a change. It's a change especially to the foreign policy establishment in Washington in terms of the way they think about foreign policy. I do think it's more in line with the average voter on Main Street America. I think it resonates with them. I think it's more tied to our national interest. I think the president's asking a basic question. If we're going to take the next action in this country, is it in the interest of the United States to do so? And not have just a knee-jerk response that every time there's a skirmish in some part of the globe, we just send troops. I think that he's tapped into what I think has been a serious fatigue for this country, for a lot of moms and a lot of dads out there who've had their kids injured in the last wars that we've been in. And I think probably pretty grateful that he's not trying to redeploy them everywhere in the world right now. So I don't know that that's necessarily consistent with how foreign policy's worked in this town. I think again, it's much more of a kind of a Nixonian realpolitik, kind of a practical foreign policy based on our interests.
Carl?
I was looking back at a big poll the other day. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs releases a big foreign policy poll every 2 years, and they didn't include all the questions this year that I would have liked, but there's one question in which they ask about the top foreign policy goals for the United States, and in 15 of the last 18 askings of that question, going back to 72, protecting American jobs was either number 1 or 2, behind terrorism, or terrorism was not. And at the bottom of the list was promoting democracy abroad. Now, maybe all of us think that we should do some work to promote democracy abroad, but that said, it's not where the American people are, and so I think it's the course correction that Rick just described.
Well, understand, pre-Trump, the Republican base was already migrating from the country club to the country. It was becoming a more rural party.
Yep.
They were shedding suburban, higher income, higher educated voters. This was prior to Trump. And I think he saw that in a way that Bush and Christie and Kasich probably didn't see it. And he has put his stamp, if you will, an exclamation point on that. It started with the social issues. It started with guns and gays and climate change and these issues that affected Appalachia and some of these rural areas. But when you add trade to that, it became combustible in rural America and places who felt that their economies were being hollowed out. So the ultimate question is Trump changed the coalitions or in a realignment, or are we in a de-alignment right now, where you have a group of people, both suburban, upscale people and folks in let's say in the Midwest and factory towns and failing rural areas that don't really trust either party, that went with Trump, want to wait and see what happens. I can tell you my suburban voters out in Fairfax haven't bought into the Democratic Party. They've been voting Democratic. But I always note that the same day they gave Hillary Clinton 65% of the vote, they defeated a meals tax for schools. That still on economics, these people make a lot of money and they're not big into redistribution. And Bernie Sanders did miserably there in the primary. So I think this is still up in the air, and foreign policy is a part of that. You get a loyalty to somebody, you want to trust this leader, and I think Donald Trump has been able to move the party on this, saying we're doing things that may not be conventional, pulling out of Paris, doing away with the Iran deal. But to date, there has really been no blowback on that the average person can see.
Right.
He's, without a doubt, redefined what it means to be a Republican president. It's a time where many long-held policies by the Republican Party, like trade, are being rethought. But I think what's important to remember here is that many of these sentiments that he talked about in the campaign, such as the system is rigged, or people's voices not being heard, or we need to get better deals for trade, those were sentiments that had been out there long before Donald Trump ever came along as a candidate. I remember hearing sentiments like that in 2012 and 2013 before he ever announced. So I think it's important. He managed to tap into those beliefs. I think that's why you have voters being, I've heard some voters say they're invested in him. They're invested in his candidacy for the first time of any political candidate they've ever supported before. So understand that he tapped into a belief system that was out there, and it's not going to end with him either. I think this is a long-term belief system that we're going to be confronted.
But that belief system hadn't really been part of the Republican narrative
prior
to Donald Trump.
Right. Yeah.
And he saw it and brought that in. And when you bring people into the coalition, other people leave, and that's what's hurt him, in Fairfax and some of the higher income suburbs.
Okay, so we've got a few minutes for questions from the audience. I think we've got some mics, and so when you ask your question, please introduce yourself and do ask a question, and direct it toward a specific panelist if you like. Go ahead. Do we have mics available?
We'll go ahead and just ask him.
Okay, go ahead.
Some of these are issues that 2020 candidates and the Senate are certainly campaigning upon, and we've already seen some resolutions offered that are expected to be resubmitted in the next Congress by Democrats.
I don't think most members want to vote on this stuff, quite frankly. They like being able to nitpick a president's decision without having... look, a lot of us made a vote on the Iraq War that we didn't vote for what happened, but we were responsible for what happened at the end of the day. So members are really gun-shy about coming out there and having to vote. There are always people on the extremes that are catering to, if you will, the wings of the party, saying, I'm going to be out there, I'm the leader on this. But I can tell you, the average member wants to stay away from this stuff. So I don't know that we're likely to see votes on these kind of issues because both Republicans and Democrats try to shy away from owning outcomes in these foreign policy issues.
I do think the exception is that you've got a large number of senators who are going to be running in the Democratic primary. And I think even if the Senate stays Republican, I think it will, and I think there will actually be some gains. You do have rules to your advantage in the Senate that if you work with your minority leader, you can find a chance to force votes from time to time. So you might see some things pop up on the Senate side. If it flips and the House assumes the gavels, I still think there's going to be pressure, maybe even more so, for the Senate members who are running for president to put pressure on the House Democrats to force votes so they can leverage that to try to get the same vote in the Senate. So I think you could see this cat and mouse game on not only those issues, but a whole raft of issues across the board.
But let me just really quick add to that. The problem for Democrats is if they take the House, these new members that help them become the majority are from these really swing districts, where these votes are absolutely poison. Yeah. Right. And so they've got to decide. Pelosi's been through this once. She made people walk the plank on Obamacare, which at the time was very unpopular, and cap and trade and lost the House. Or do we want to try to keep it? And so that's the dilemma they're going to face.
Which means their decision could be, are we going to have all these votes because we feel like this is going to help us win the presidency back at the expense of the House?
No, they just are tribal, but we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, now we see some more hands. Go ahead.
Well, they won't want to do that.
Thank you. My concern, my name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation. My concern is the migrant caravan. I don't know when they're going to reach the southern border.
Right.
But the Trump is saying they can bring military, National Guards and so forth. They may even use the tear gas and so forth. My concern is that are they going to, the caravan, are they going to peacefully back off, or there going to be some violence? And if that's the case, my concern is that that may throw a stone at the Trump administration.
Well, I certainly can't predict what's going to happen once it reaches the border. I do know that the president and the administration are concerned. I do think, and you've heard a lot of comments even today a lot of encouragement for the Mexican government to encourage them to help us with the situation, to do everything that they possibly can to help diffuse it before it actually bubbles up at the southern border. But ultimately, it's the job of the President of the United States to make sure that our country is secure. He'll need to do so in a responsible and thoughtful way. And he's got great people that work for him that'll try to figure out the best way to approach the situation. But I think right now, trying to do what we can to help the Mexican government deal with the caravan as it's coming up might be the best first step on how to handle it as it gets closer to the border.
Okay, right here.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel Miner. I'm from the Senate. I think you've hit on all the key points, but I want to bring up one that we haven't addressed, particularly in the context of independent voters or that group that may swing on some of these key issues. What about women's issues? We've seen that surface, especially with the Kavanaugh hearings and confirmation, and in a number of other cases more recently, especially in light of Clinton losing the presidential race in 2016. Do you think that women voters have a key voice in the midterms, or is that purely reserved for the presidential election?
Sure, they have a voice, and we see a huge gender gap coming. I just know Trump carried white women in the last election, and I don't know whether Republicans carry them in the midterm this time or not. I don't know. In the Kavanaugh, there is some effect, but women aren't a monolithic group. You can break them up into minority women. Republicans, particularly Trump, loses overwhelmingly. Sure, women are going to play a role. They got a lot of women candidates going this time, I think more than any time in history. And yeah, that plays a role for the Democrats this time, and it's one of the things they have going for them. I'm not sure where that takes them, but it's a good thing for Democrats.
There's been a lot of speculation about, is this going to be the year of the woman? But I think every election is the year of the woman because women are the majority electorate. And so whenever I hear women voters talked about as some sort of minority outreach group, that's completely a false misnomer. So as the majority electorate, women are going to have the ultimate say-so in what happens in this election. And one of the numbers that I think gets forgotten about a lot is in 2010 when Republicans won the House, they won women by one. It's kind of amazing how many people don't know that. So I think women being the majority electorate will ultimately determine the outcome.
There's an enormous amount of misunderstanding about the gender gap. Ronald Reagan's gender gap was exactly the same size as Bob Dole's. One won, the other lost. It's not the size of the gender gap, it's directionality, its turnout, and it looks at this point that women are more enthused about turning out than are men.
By the way, we're seeing that in the absentee ballot. If you look at absentees, Republicans are actually doing better than Democrats right now in absentees, but women are doing proportionally better than men in the absentees.
Gentleman back here.
Thanks so much, Josh Rogan, Washington Post. Thanks for doing this. I'd like to ask you about the influence of the evangelical voter base on foreign policy. If I look at the Trump administration's actions, I see data points, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, which has several constituencies, including evangelicals, the amount of time and attention dedicated to the securing the release of Pastor Brunson, the high-level attention dedicated to international religious freedom this year. And if you think about it, these are a series of events that kind of doesn't fit with a purely interest-based nationalist, right? These are values-based kinds of things. And I'm just generally curious, what's your take on it? Do you see an increased amount of influence coming from the evangelical base? And do you see the Trump administration responding to that base by making foreign policy moves that play to those voters, especially in the run-up to this election? Thank you.
Well, I'll start and just say that I think the president did a very good job of cultivating those voters during the election. I think that he's tried to cultivate and build a coalition among a lot of different kind of value voters based on different interests, including evangelicals. And he never forgets those voting groups, and he's always working to find issues that resonate with them, to keep them engaged and make sure that he's on top of the issues that they care about. So I agree with the point that you made, that he's found things like moving the embassy or the pastor in Turkey. Religious freedom issues. I think there will be others that bubble up. He's got a large number of really good advisors in the evangelical community, citizens that come in and that he talks to a lot, the administration talks to a lot, and as they raise issues of concern, I think he'll be sensitive to that. But I think he's also sensitive to our farmers. I think he's sensitive to the American workers. I mean, I wouldn't say that they necessarily are stacked up in some special category versus another. I think he's built a very unique coalition. I think he's very cognizant of that, and I think he tries to cultivate it on a daily basis.
I agree. And don't forget the court fight, what that does. Really, the court fights, I think, galvanize Christian voters.
That was an issue that caused many Republican voters to come home in October of 2016.
Right here.
Thank you. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. With the increasing numbers of voters turned out from the Asian Americans community, how would that affect the foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific area, especially in the South China Sea? And I think the Vietnamese Americans are one of the group that is noted for voting for Trump in the past election. And they are very much motivated by what he's doing now toward the issues in the South China Sea.
You want to tackle that?
I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's right. Standing up to China is something that his predecessors were unwilling to do. They toyed with China. Everybody understands that eventually China wants to displace us as the #1 economy in the world, and who knows what else. And the fact that he stood up, I think, for these other countries. People bring their country to America. There's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of the tradition. There are a couple of great races out in Orange County, California, where you have a Korean American running against a Hispanic, and his seat is Republicans have been losing the Asian vote worse than the Hispanic vote. When you take a look at it, we're going to watch this midterm now as they run a few more Asian candidates and see how that ferrets out. But I hadn't thought of that point about how China plays with the Vietnamese and Japanese Americans and the like. But it could have, long term, it could have a play.
I think the president's been very focused. I mean, one of the best relationships he has is with Abe of Japan. I mean, they're very close. He's paid a lot of attention to what's going on in the South China Sea. We had two warships just go through the Strait of Taiwan, I think, either today or yesterday. So, showing our strength, showing our support. And I think we are trying to cultivate relationships with the Pacific Asian community. And that probably resonates with those who identify with those communities back home as they vote too.
One last question in the back, sir.
Obred Kesic, TSM Global Consultants. I want to try to get you to focus a little bit towards 2020 with one particular issue pertaining to Trump voters and kind of the voter base. The perception or the reality of a resistance to a Trump foreign policy within the administration itself as well as in Congress. Does that play a factor at all as voters go to the polls, even as a secondary factor? And then 2020, does that also position the president as, in some way, again, being a victim of the system and being an outsider and kind of positioning him in a much better position going forward because he's not able to deliver because of the resistance to his policies?
Well, I'll just take the second question first. I think that's probably the best way to handle it in 2020 from his vantage point. If he's going to see resistance, he'll use that to his advantage in the campaign. In terms of actual resistance to the administration, my money would be on the president. And I think that he's very capable of making sure everybody falls in line behind what he'd like to see done, regardless of what you might read. And I think he'll chalk up a lot of victories on that front. In terms of the resistance he might get on the Hill, some of that's going to be tied, a lot of it's going to be tied to what happens in the elections. I think in his own party, I think there will be pockets of concern. But in general, I think that people, recognize that as the head of the party, as he's promoting his foreign policy, I think there is, at least as the meetings that I was always in, there was always a desire to try to be supportive of the president in that role. If the House goes Democrat, it'll be a completely different story in terms of the kinds of kinds of roadblocks they might throw up.
The selected leaks on the president early on, from his discussions with the Prime Minister of Australia straight on, leaks were really unprecedented, and I think damaged him coming off. But 2020 is different. Midterms generally are referendums on the president. Midterms are about, presidential elections are competing visions. what's really going to matter who the Democrats put up. Are they going to move? Republicans had their Tea Party phase. Democrats now have the herbal Tea Party phase. And what you see over there is a move left, and you watch some of these Democratic senators and where they're positioning themselves to go after that electorate. That leaves plenty of room for the president to be reelected, depending on who they can put up. In the old days, if you nominated a Goldwater, and I was a Goldwater guy, but if you nominated Goldwater or McGovern that were out of the extreme, the party came back, the other party moved to the center and picked up those center votes. That doesn't happen anymore. Clinton didn't move to the center. She moved left to keep Sanders voters. We're at a time of political disruption. You could actually have third and fourth parties coming into play in this next election. It's that disruptive with the new media and the like. So it's a long way away at this point.
I think for 2020, Trump voters are going to say, is he delivering on the change that we elected him for? We were perfectly willing to rock the boat in 2016. If the answer is no, he's not, they can rock the boat again. We just don't know where that's going, but it's going to be, is he delivering on the change? And why?
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.
Can you keep